Welcome everyone to Wildlife and Water Friendly Gardens. We're into week 3 of our 2025 season. My name is Michelle Scholes. I am an instructor and general coordinator here at the Environmental Learning Center on the campus of Clackamas Community College here in near Oregon City. So we're very glad you could join us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this series, or our main sponsor is Clackamas Water Environment Services, and they enable us to put these on free of charge. So thank you to them for their financial support. We also have several partner organizations who are listed there on the screen, which include Oak Lodge Water Services, Greater Oregon City Watershed Council, North Clackamas Watersheds Council, Tryon Creek Watershed Council, Clackamas River Basin Council, and Clackamas River Water Providers. So thank you for the support that they provide, including many of our introductory speakers, such as Dakota, who will be providing an introduction, giving us some watershed perspectives for today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Alexis, our moderator from Tryon Creek Watershed Council, to introduce our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm hoping that our connection holds through. You'll see that I'm actually with our watershed introduction speaker today. Dakota and I are at a conference in Stevenson, Washington. And thank you all for joining us. Some of the housekeeping items, one of which Michelle already mentioned, is to please stay on mute during the presentation. My main duty today, after I introduce our speakers, is to track the questions and answers. So please submit any questions via chat, and I'll be conveying those at the end of the presentation today. So now I get to introduce Dakota and Angela. Dakota is an entomologist with a heavy focus on community outreach, youth programming,
Oh, I think Alexis is frozen there. So when you come back, we were just hearing the introduction from Dakota. Let's hope that we can get her back.
I'm going to go ahead and stay off video.
Okay, maybe the video is proving too much. So
yeah, hopes of a better connection. My apologies.
You're kind of breaking up a bit, Alexis. Hopefully we'll get you back in a minute, maybe if she rejoins. And then we will be able to hear our introduction from Dakota. If they're not having success, I do have Dakota's script and I can provide some of that information if we don't succeed.
I'm tentatively back. Dakota's going to work to join from her phone. I'm going to briefly finish introducing Dakota and Angela in hopes of a strong connection, and Dakota will just be speaking via audio. So Dakota is an entomologist with a heavy focus on community outreach, youth programming, and science education. She's been at Clackamas County since 2007, and when not at work can be found with her animals, hiking with her daughter, or hunting for bugs. Angela Laws, PhD, is an endangered species conservation biologist based in Sacramento, California. Angela is working on habitat restoration for pollinators and monarch butterflies in the Central Valley. Her role at the Xerces Society also involves incorporating climate resiliency into pollinator restoration projects. Angela has over 25 years of experience studying arthropods and grassland habitats, including studies of how climate change can affect species interactions. She received an MS in ecology from Utah State University and a PhD in biology from the University of Notre Dame. All right, I'm hoping that held through and we can listen to Dakota. Go ahead now.
Hello, everyone. Oh, get rid of that echo. There we go. Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Alexis. I'm Dakota Hufford. I'm the Communications and Program Coordinator at Clackamas River Basin Council, and I'm really excited to be here today and introduce today's topic and help welcome our fabulous presenter. Thank you for having me. Despite their lack of having one, insects are the proverbial backbone of all food webs, and pollinating insects hold a special key to the survival of many, if not all, ecosystems around the world. They are staples of a healthy environment that is in turn able to support everyone else, including humans. Next slide. Insect pollinators are responsible for the successful reproduction of over 80% of the flowering plants in the world and more than 2/3 of the world's crops. And within the United States alone, pollinators provide over $200 billion worth of ecosystem services per year. Further, many pollinators, including native bees specifically, are both keystone and indicator species, elevating them to a higher importance in the success of any given ecosystem. A keystone species is an animal who has a disproportionate effect on their environment, and an indicator species means that we can look to populations as a reflection of other environmental factors, both good and bad. Here in Clackamas County, we have an abundance of native pollinators that have evolved and adapted alongside the native plant assemblages, working in harmony over millions of years to create a functional ecosystem. This coevolution and coadaptation means that our pollinators and plants function really well together. However, some of them are quite dependent on one another to the point that they cannot survive without each other. When introduced species take over a habitat once populated by native species, those natives are outcompeted and habitat becomes less overall functional for everyone. Even with species that are not co-adapted, we are all deeply connected. Healthy watersheds, which provide water, food, and necessary resources to all life, require a strong population of native pollinators and other insects. They keep plant population healthy, which in turn helps keep our water clean. There is no getting around the intrinsic interconnectedness of water, humans, pollinators, and all other living creatures. And the Clackamas River specifically provides drinking water for over 350,000 people, a system which functions in large part due to the work of these native pollinators. It's estimated that 1 in 5 invertebrates is at risk of extinction. For some perspective, of the estimated 30 million known species living now, 90% are invertebrates. Studies have shown a 23% decline in wild bees in the United States from 2008 to 2013. And globally, it's estimated that 1 in 6 bees are regionally extinct and that more than 40% are vulnerable to extinction. Some primary reasons for these declines are human development, habitat loss, pesticide usage, and pesticide usage. Additionally, culturally, historic poor attitudes and lack of understanding towards invertebrates in general has fanned the dangerous flames for pollinators and all insects, and I believe we can do better. That can all start to feel a little bleak, but I think it's important to remember that we can only control our own behavior, and if you start there, then that is the first step to a larger change. Here are some really quick actionable items around the county or metro area that you can do to take some action. Take the pesticide pledge. CRBC has one for Clackamas River Basin residents, and Metro has one for other folks. You can get your free yard sign and show your neighbors that you're committed to a chemical-free yard. Check out the Portland plant list. Volunteer with an environmental nonprofit. We have tons of events coming up at CRBC. I know Tryon does too. We're out here doing stuff. And then, really just spread the word. Tell everybody how important insects and pollinators are, how neat they are, the good work they do. And I personally think that's a good way to be a pollinator ally. Thank you again for your time and commitment to bettering our collective relationship with our land. And thank you, Angela, for being here with us today.
That was really great. Thank you, Dakota. Okay. Yeah, that was a really great intro and a good overview of some of the things that I'm going to cover today. And so I just want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to join me as I talk about habitat gardening for pollinators. I'm a biologist with the Xerces Society, and Xerces is a nonprofit whose mission is to protect biodiversity by protecting invertebrates and their habitat. Our name comes from the Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first butterfly in North America known to go extinct from human activity. A lot of our work focuses on pollinators and reducing pesticide exposure and also protecting endangered species. So our mission is biodiversity, protection, and Dakota talked about how many invertebrates are at risk of extinction. And I think hopefully you're all fresh and still paying attention. One of the main messages that I like to convey is that biodiversity and climate change are linked. The fight to protect biodiversity and the fight to address climate change are the same, and they can't be decoupled. We have to address climate change if we want to protect biodiversity, and we need biodiversity to help us adapt to and mitigate climate change. And so I think that, as we move forward, when we talk about, how do we address climate change, how do we protect biodiversity, I think that we're missing a lot of opportunities for not talking about those things in concert. And the other message I want to share today is that I think that we can help through habitat gardening. I think that we can help protect biodiversity in our communities and buffer the effects of climate change on pollinators and other wildlife in our communities through the way we garden, by creating habitat, by creating these diverse landscapes in our communities that are sequestering carbon and supporting a diversity of pollinators. I think that we can make an impact. So that's my my bottom line. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology of pollinators very briefly. I'm going to touch on some of the effects of climate change can have on pollinators, and then I'm going to talk about how we can garden for pollinators. So as Dakota mentioned, pollinators are incredibly important in terrestrial ecosystems around the world. More than 85% of all flowering plants require an animal, usually an insect, for pollination and reproduction. Insects are really important pollinators, and these are the most important groups of insects that pollinate plants. We've got butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps, and bees. And of these, bees are the most important and efficient pollinators because they actively collect pollen for their offspring. Now, when people think of bees, a lot of times they think of honeybees, and honeybees are incredibly important to our agriculture and our economy. They're fascinating animals. They're actually not native to North America. They're native to Europe. They were brought here with Europeans. And we actually have an incredibly diverse community of bees living in around the world. Here in the US and Canada, there are roughly 3,600 different species of bees, and they're all really important for pollinating native plants and keeping our ecosystems moving. Most bees are actually solitary. They don't live in hives. So 70% of all bees are ground nesting bees. So they dig their nests in the ground, sometimes several feet into the ground, and usually it's just one female doing all of the work. About 30% of bees are cavity nesting bees, so they will nest in pithy stemmed plants or in cavities in dead logs, things like that. And only about 1% of bees are hive nesting bees. So these are honeybees and bumblebees. This is the typical life cycle for a ground nesting bee. So these are animals that spend most of their life underground. So the females emerge in spring or summer. They actively collect pollen, and then they dig their nests and they create these little brood cells. It's like a little nursery, one for each egg, right? So they dig out this little hollow, they fill it they collect a bunch of pollen and create a little pollen loaf, which you can see here at the bottom. And then they'll lay one egg on it, close up the brood cell, and then start building another, and then start collecting pollen for that brood cell. The egg hatches, and the little larvae feeds on that egg until it reaches the pupal stage here on the left, and then it just hangs out there until it's time to emerge again in the spring or summer. So they're spending about 11 months of the year underground and only about 1 month of the year above ground. And for some bees are specialists, which means that they only collect pollen from a certain family or certain genus of flowers. And a lot of times their emergence is timed to match the time when those flowers bloom. And as I said, most bees are solitary, so they're not living in a hive, they're not working communally. It's just one, each individual female doing all of the work to create nests and provision them on her own. Native bees are wonderfully diverse. They come in all shapes and sizes. This is a photo of the smallest known species of bee on the head of the largest known species of bee. So you can see there's a big variation there in the size. As I said, most of them are solitary. Most are gentle and unlikely to sting. This is a photo of what we call a chapleg bee, and you can see these really long hairs on its legs. Those are called scopa. So most bees have these specialized hairs that they pack up with pollen so that they can carry it back to their nests. This is a bumblebee. So I'm just going to show you some different pictures of different bees. Bumblebees are probably one of the most easily recognizable types of bees. We have a community science program called Bumblebee Watch. So if you're out and you see a bumblebee, you can take a picture of it and post the photos on Bumblebee Watch, and an expert will help you ID those bees. You see this bee, it looks like it has like wet pollen packed onto its leg. Bumblebees and honeybees have, instead of having those fancy hairs for collecting pollen, they have what's called a pollen basket. So their leg is kind of a concave shape, kind of like a bowl, and they just pack wet pollen in there and it sticks, and that's how they transport their pollen. These can be beautiful. This is a metallic green sweat bee. Some of them are just fabulous, like metallic greens or metallic blues. Some of them have lots of yellow and white markings. The Nomia genus have these wonderful enamel-like bands on their abdomen that look like opals. So they can be really, really beautiful animals. This little guy is a cuckoo bee, and for the birders in the audience, you might be able to guess something about this bee's life history. You'll notice there's no hairs on this bee for collecting pollen. That's because they don't bother. They hang around the nests of other species of bees and then sneak in and lay their eggs in the brood cells of other species of bees so that their offspring can eat the pollen that somebody else collected. So they're a nest parasite. And there are many species of cuckoo bees. This is a nocturnal bee. You see the ocelli, those 3 ocelli on the top of the head are really enlarged in these bees so that they can see in the dark. So these bees are active at night. This is a blue orchard bee, metallic blue, really pretty. These are really efficient pollinators, and they're cavity nesting bees, and there's been some work trying to rear these bees commercially for use in agriculture because they are more efficient pollinators than honeybees of tree crops. This is a leafcutter bee. These are megachilids, and this is one of my favorite families of bee. You'll notice the fuzzy abdomen. So these bees, their specialized hair is for collecting pollen around their bellies rather than on their legs. They're super cute. They're cavity nesting bees, and they line the nest cells with pieces of leaf. You can see on the right, this is a redbud, and you can see they cut almost these perfectly circular pieces of plant to line their nest cells. So if you're out in your garden and you see it looks like somebody attacked one of your plants with a hole punch, it probably means you have some leafcutter bees around. Now, Dakota mentioned insect declines that we're seeing, and specifically declines in pollinators. And this is something that I think is getting more and more attention lately. And I think it's something that many of us have noticed over the course of their lifetimes through what's called the windshield effect. So I remember as a kid driving through the country with my parents, the windshield and the front of the car would be splattered in dead bugs, right? And that really doesn't happen anymore. And so many of us are noticing this decline in insect abundance, and there have been more and more studies coming out lately, more and more long-term studies showing the same phenomenon with data. So just a few examples of that: leafcutter bees, the ones that I showed you a picture of. About 50% of all leafcutter bee species are at risk. About 27% of mason bees are at risk. So this is the group that includes those blue orchard bees. And about 1/4 of all native North American bumblebees are at some risk of extinction. This also goes for butterflies. So, for example, in Ohio, a 21-year data set found that butterfly abundances, so the number of butterflies you see when you go out in the environment, decreased about 33% over those 20 years. In the UK, over a 10-year period, they found that over half, 52% of all butterfly species had declined in abundance. And here in California, I'm based in Sacramento, there's a data set, a 45-year data set, monitoring these plots that go all the way from the Bay Area up to the Sierra Nevadas, finding that butterflies are decreasing at all low elevation sites and in all groups of butterflies. So we're seeing these big decreases in butterflies and bees and other pollinators and insects. What's driving these declines? These are sort of the usual suspects. So whenever you think about a particular species in a particular place, there's going to be, a different mix of causes, but these are generally the things that are all contributing. Habitat loss is, of course, very important. And whenever we're talking about biodiversity declines, habitat loss is almost always in there playing a big role. It's hard for a species to persist if they have nowhere to live, right? Pesticides, especially the use of insecticides, are playing a big role. I'll talk about that briefly a little bit more. Invasive plants that displace important food plants for insects are important. Pollution and disease, changes in land use and land management, and of course, climate change. And the effects of climate change are becoming more and more apparent. And as we're starting to feel the effects of climate change, we're starting to see more and more effects on pollinators and other animals. So how will climate change affect pollinators? Of course, not all pollinators will be negatively affected. Some might not be affected at all, some will benefit, but many species will not be positively impacted on climate change. There are more and more studies showing impacts of climate change on pollinator biodiversity and pollinator abundance. This is one example. So this is a study on bumblebees that came out a couple years ago, and they looked at bumblebee populations in North America and Europe. So you can see, here's the data from North America. You can see that the continent is divided into these little squares, these little grids. And anywhere where there's darker, warmer colors, like the dark red, are places where they're seeing lots of bumblebee declines. And so what they did is they looked at each of these grid cells and they said, okay, what was the temperature during 1901 to 1974? So these are the baseline temperatures. So what was the temperature like historically? And what is the temperature like currently? So their current temperature data was collected from 2000 to 2015. And what they found was that current temperature, or bumblebee declines, were highest in areas where the current temperatures were warmer than the maximum baseline temperatures. So another way of saying that is that anywhere where it's hotter now than it used to be historically is where we're seeing biggest declines in bumblebees. So this is just one example that we're seeing. And so what is causing this? Why is climate change leading to declines in pollinators? These are just a few of the ways that climate change can affect pollinators and other insects. So physiology. Insects we know are cold-blooded, right? So temperature is really important to all sorts of biological processes. It affects how long they live, how big they are when they're adults, how long it takes to become adults, how many offspring they produce, how fast they digest their food and how many nutrients they get from it. When can they start being active during the day and how long can they be active? All of these things are governed by temperature. And small increases in temperature could be beneficial. But once it gets too hot and they're bumping up against those the maximum temperature that they can tolerate, it starts to have negative impacts on their survival, on reproduction. It starts to have negative impacts on populations. So here in California, climate change is going to cause more heat waves, more intense heat waves that last longer and get hotter. And so these high temperatures can stress pollinators and lead to reductions in reproduction, for example. Another big one people talk about with pollinators and climate change is phenological mismatches. Now, phenology is just a fancy word for the timing of biological events. So like the timing of bud burst in the spring, looking at when your daffodils bloom each year, that's phenology. And the concern is that pollinators and plants might be responding to different cues. So for example, if pollinators are emerging in the spring in response to temperature, but flowers are blooming in response to day length, you could get a mismatch between when the pollinators come out and when the flowers are present, which could be negative for both the pollinators and the plants that are relying on them. Another possibility is range shifts. So some species may move farther north or to higher altitudes to track the conditions that they're acclimated to. Not all species will move. Some species can't. It requires habitat to move to. If you're already high altitude, you can't move higher up. With some North American bumblebees, what we're noticing is that their southern portion of their range is moving north, but the northern portion of the range doesn't seem to be moving. So there's a lot of species-specific things happening there. It depends on the species and where they are, but this is just another potential impact. And then, of course, plants are responding to climate change, right? So if you get more drought, there are going to be fewer flowers on the landscape. It could change which species are most abundant, which affects the pollinators that depend on those. There's even some studies showing that increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can change the attractiveness of flowers to pollinators and the nutritional composition of nectar and pollen. So there are lots of different ways that climate change can affect pollinators, and of course these can all be happening at once. The other thing I want to point out is in this simplified diagram, I have each of these things independently affecting insects, but really they can all interact as well, right? So you can imagine a situation in which a pollinator gets exposed to maybe some small dose of pesticides, and maybe under normal situations, a small dose is fine. Like the animal, it doesn't die, it's fine. But maybe during a heat wave, when the animal is stressed, or during a drought when there's not many resources, maybe that same dosage of pesticide exposure becomes lethal. So the point is just that these different drivers of insect declines can interact and magnify negative impacts of climate change or these other drivers. We just need to be thinking about the ways that these things can interact. Okay, so this is all a lot, but I do think that there's a lot we can do to help. And at Xerces, our approach, we sort of have this three-pronged approach. We need to restore and protect habitat, increase habitat connectivity, and reduce additional stressors, things like pesticide risk and disease. In general, larger populations are less vulnerable to extinction than small populations. And so the more habitat that's available, the bigger the population can be, and the less vulnerable they are to extinction. So that's one reason why it's really important to restore and protect habitat. Connectivity is how close different patches of habitat are to each other. So every patch, every garden that pops up in your community increases habitat connectivity in your community and increases the ability of pollinators in your community to withstand bad years or negative impacts of climate change. You can imagine, for example, if you have a population here in this patch and something happens and the population gets knocked down, if you have another patch of habitat nearby, individuals from that patch can move into the original one and kind of rescue that population. So that's why having habitat that's connected can be important. So how do we do that? We create habitat gardens. And I just want to reiterate that no space is too small. This includes container gardens or parking strips. If you don't have a yard, maybe you just have a patio, or you're renting and you can't rip out the lawn and plant habitat. Even small places matter when it comes to pollinators, and also thinking about this at the community level, right? Because every patch of habitat that gets added helps support pollinators in your community. These are some of our guidelines. I think the best thing is to aim for biodiversity. So you want to use a variety of nectar and pollen plants, trying to have at least 3 species flowering at all times during the active season, so spring through fall. More is better. As many plant species as you can get in to your space. You want to think about bloom times, so species that are blooming at different times, species that have different colors and shapes. The more species you have, the more pollinators you'll be able to support, because as I showed you, bees come in different shapes and sizes, and they're attracted to different types of flowers. Bees tend to like flowers planted in masses, so having several species or several plants of the same species together is highly attractive, as opposed to having those species like evenly spread out. Native plants tend to support a wider variety of pollinators than ornamentals, and native plants are also more likely to support specialist bees and butterflies. So remember, I talked about some bees are specialists and only take pollen from certain groups or genera of plants. The more plants you have, the more of these specialists you can support. Another example of a specialist that most people are probably familiar with are monarchs, right? The larvae, the caterpillars only feed on milkweed. Many butterflies are specialists in the caterpillar stage. So having high biodiversity will support more pollinators. You want to include some nesting and overwintering site. We'll talk about that in a minute. In terms of butterflies and moths, many species of butterflies and moths use native trees as host plants. So planting native trees is really valuable for supporting those animals. Things like oaks. Oaks are amazing. And native trees tend to support many more species of butterflies and moths than ornamental trees. And they also have the benefit of taking up lots of carbon and providing shade, and having a thick, healthy urban forest canopy, having lots of trees in your neighborhood can help reduce temperatures during heat waves. And then, of course, you want to protect habitat from pesticides. So we have a pollinator conservation resource center with tons of resources, and I think they'll put a link to that in the chat. If you click on your state, we have plant lists and other guidance on creating habitat. But you can see, like from these photos, we have this diverse habitat, and compare that in your mind to just a lawn, right? So we're providing food for animals and also shade, right? When it gets really hot, having all of these plants creates these little micro environments where a bee could go in and cool off, compared to like a lawn doesn't provide that type of habitat. In terms of overwintering and nesting resources, we have a new guide on creating nesting and overwintering habitat that they'll put a link to. For ground nesting bees, it's important to leave some areas undisturbed and some patches of bare soil. So you want to avoid using landscape fabric and heavy mulch everywhere in your yard, right? It doesn't have to be a huge space, just some places where you have some bare soil, especially if you have direct sunlight. And it doesn't have to be big. So this red arrow is pointing to a little bee nest at the base of this rock. So it's not like you need huge swaths of bare soil, but just little patches here and there that provide places where these ground nesting bees can nest.
Angela, I'm just coming off mute to let you know that we're at about that 10-minute warning mark.
Okay, I think we're good.
Cool.
Thank you. A few, you guys listed your favorite pollinator plants, and some of you have some of the things I'm going to talk about. I am in Sacramento. I know a lot of you are in Oregon, but a lot of these can be found there. My favorite pollinator plant, especially for butterflies, is coyote mint. It smells nice, it's attractive, and as soon as it blooms, I get butterflies everywhere. So that's one of my favorites. Monardellas are great if you're in the eastern half of the country. Look for Monarda plants. Salvias are wonderful for bumblebees, other pollinators. Hummingbirds love them. Great pollinator plants. buckwheats. There are many species of blue butterflies that use buckwheats as host plants, the way that monarchs use milkweed, and bees love them. You can, whenever I find a buckwheat in bloom, there's always a cloud of bees around them. And then, of course, phacelias here on the right are bee magnets. Many of them are annuals, but there are some perennials. They're just fabulous pollinator plants. I have 2 in my yard. They tend to like full sun, and my yard's pretty shady, but every time I check on this plant, I can find at least 3 species of bees on it. So highly recommended. Here's some others that I love. Lupins are great for bumblebees. Asters are great late season nectar. Michelle mentioned currants. Ribes are great for hummingbirds and bumblebees. Grasses. So there are many species of butterflies, including the skippers, that use grasses as host plants. And some above ground nesting bumblebees will nest at the bases of large bunch grasses. Thistles are fabulous pollinator plants. In Oregon and California, if you can get hold of cobweb thistle, it's beautiful. It's not aggressive. It's not going to take over. Sometimes you can find seed. It's really beautiful, and it's fun to watch bees like swimming around in the blooms. Birds like it too. Okay, we also want to reduce additional stressors. So that's creating habitat in a nutshell. Check out our website for more information. And then reducing those other stressors. I'm going to talk a little bit about pesticides in particular. Right, because pesticides can interact. These other drivers of climate change these other drivers of insect decline can interact and sort of magnify negative impacts of climate change on invertebrates like pollinators. So as much as possible, reduce the use of pesticides, especially insecticides. Most insecticides are broad spectrum, which means they're designed to harm all invertebrates. So maybe you're spraying because you don't want to see aphids or ants. Any invertebrate that comes in contact with that pesticide is going to be harmed by it. Be especially careful of neonicotinoids and other systemic insecticides. So what is a systemic insecticide? Is one that takes up the pesticide and then expresses it in all the tissues. So you can imagine maybe a plant gets sprayed with a neonic before it flowers. When that plant flowers, those pesticides will show up in the pollen and the nectar. And especially with neonics, they're highly toxic to bees and they stick around for months. They also get in the soil and can be taken up by the surrounding plants. This is especially a problem if you're purchasing a plant that happens to have been treated with pesticides. And we did a study a couple of years ago where we collected milkweed from 33 nurseries around the country. We had something like 230 plants, tested them for pesticides. Every single plant had pesticides with an average of 12 pesticides per plant. And so this is a problem. I think it's one where I think consumers have a lot of control. If we go to our nurseries and say, I want plants free of pesticides that could be harmful for monarchs and other pollinators. And we do have some guidance on buying bee-safe pollinator plants because of this risk. But I do think that nurseries will respond to this if this is something that they hear that their customers want. So I think they'll put that link in the chat. Okay, so I do think we can help. I think we can create habitat. We want to avoid pesticide use, especially insecticides, plant native plants, do our best to buy bee-safe plants, and then advocate for change on climate change. All of these things I think will help, but ultimately we do have to address carbon emissions. This is my tiny little yard. You see it's tiny. And sometimes it does feel like, I'm doing this. Sometimes when I put this talk together, I'm like, is it too Pollyanna? I'm working in this garden alone. Does it matter? But the answer is that yes, it does matter, because my little garden does not have to support all of the pollinators in my community alone. Even though I'm pulling the weeds by myself, there are other people creating habitat. There's the house across the street. There's another garden, one block over. There's container gardens in the apartment complex 2 streets away. What we do matters, and when we create this habitat, we may be doing it ourselves, but we're not acting alone, and our impact snowballs and adds up onto the impact that other people have, the other habitat that people are creating. And we are increasing connectivity and creating more habitat and being able to support more pollinators in our community through each of our individual actions. So I do think that it matters. The last thing I want to tell you about is our Habitat Kit program. So we provide free plants to people creating pollinator habitat. We have programs in these different places here. You can see the list. Each one of these programs is slightly different, have different timelines, different audiences. I know that most of you are in Oregon. So Oregon provides plants for people in working lands, public lands, so things like community gardens, schools, libraries, tribal lands, community spaces. They're not intended for home gardens, but any public space you can think of. You can use the QR code there to get more information. Project proposals for the Oregon kits will be accepted from late February to mid-April, and then the plants are available in October. So if you're interested in this, they can put the link in the chat to learn about the other kit programs. I help run our kit program in California, and it's been a great way to help people create more habitat for pollinators. And that's it. I just want to thank all of our members who make our work possible. And I also want to thank all of you for coming today and listening to me talk about gardening for pollinators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm just going to wave briefly hello as proof that we've been here and attentive, but I'm going to, we've been mostly, I'm going to turn back to being off video,
Okay.
and I'm just going to be conveying the questions that have come through on chat. One of the first questions that we received was asking if biogenetic engineering of plants affects the nutrients that pollinators receive.
I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
Probably. I mean, I think, it's interesting because when we breed plants for different things, like double-petaled variety of plants that are bred to be really attractive or sometimes smell nice, often don't provide as much pollen and nectar. So it probably depends on what traits we're selecting for that might inadvertently affect the amount of pollen and nectar provided or the quality of that.
That makes sense, more on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
I've heard something as well about nectar availability in hybrid plants, for instance. Okay, thanks. The next question was, do honeybees compete with native bees?
So it's not, most likely, yes. Yes, there is growing evidence. It's not clear cut in every case, in every location, but there is more and more evidence suggesting that honeybees can and do outcompete native bees simply because there's so much. Each hive has thousands of individuals. They're larger. Honeybees are fairly large for bees, and so they can fly farther. So there's lots of them. They're very efficient. They can move around a lot. And they do tend to outcompete native bees, or at least you see a decrease in native bees often when honeybees move into an area. So I think we had a recent webinar on this. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out Xerces' YouTube page, and we also have some guidance about it. I think that honeybees are fascinating. There's lots of reasons that people enjoy keeping bees, and that's great. But if you're interested in bee conservation, I think that planting habitat and reducing pesticide use is much more beneficial than getting and keeping honeybees.
Thank you. Next question is, do fungicide sprays harm insects?
Yes, fungicides can be detrimental to insects.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
I have,
and we have tons of information on our website about different pesticides and how they can impact pollinators and other inverts.
mhm. Okay, circling back briefly to honeybees, someone was following up in chat to ask, don't honeybees pollinate different species than native bees, or do they go after native habitat too? They would have thought that the issue was related to habitat loss for native bees.
So they will pollinate the same types of flowers. Anecdotally, I've noticed, like when I've done pollinator sampling, I'll find lots of, like if there's a patch of mustard, for example, I'll find lots of honeybees there. And then in a patch of native plants, it tends to be more native bees, but honeybees will absolutely pollinate native plants. And you do find them in natural areas. But habitat loss is certainly also playing a big role. So um, it's another factor. Does that make sense? So they can
Yeah,
use
the person already responded.
the same
Yeah, they
farm.
already said that was very helpful.
Mhm.
Great. How long do insecticides and pesticides persist in plants or soil?
It depends. So some are very short-lived.
Mhm.
But the problem with neonicotinoids is that because they're systemic and highly toxic, and they also are very long-lived. So neonics can persist for several months, and there are some studies showing where they've persisted for years when they're applied to trees. So it kind of depends on it depends on the particular type of pesticide and how it's applied and the type of plant it's applied to.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm glad that you mentioned neonics by name because one of the other questions was asking specifically how long do neonicotinoids stay active?
Yeah,
And
it can be
I Mhm. Go
for
ahead.
months. And so that's one problem, if you purchase a plant from a nursery, you just don't even think about it, right? Like I never thought about it until we did the study. If the plant has been treated with neonics and then you plant it in your garden and those neonics get in the soil and get taken up by all the surrounding plants, so that's a problem that we just want nurseries to be thinking about and maybe not using those pesticides especially on pollinator plants.
Yeah. And that's a really important conversation too, leading again into nurseries. Actually, one of the comments in chat is talking about how folks should check like their noxious weed lists before purchasing new plants at nurseries. And I think that's really important because nurseries can really vary widely, right? Like the nursery section at Home Depot would absolutely be more likely to be selling a plant that's been treated with neonicotinoids versus a local native plant nursery. Um, yeah, just there could be some big problems arising from noxious weeds. And they were asking if the Xerces Society talks about that with landowners, about checking the state noxious weed list before buying plants. Since sometimes nurseries that will actually, beyond neonicotinoids, they might sell invasive plants.
Right, right. I don't often talk about checking the noxious weed list. So that is a good idea because there are sometimes it is alarming the things that you can buy that do have the capacity to escape and become invasive. We usually really encourage people to buy native plants, and so
Mhm.
I guess kind of get around it that way. But that's a really good point and something that maybe we should incorporate more into our messaging.
Yeah, and I think I would personally, as like a restoration practitioner, would take it beyond just checking the state noxious weed list and really have that emphasis on native. And for example, in Oregon, English holly is one of the plants that we struggle with that grows very voraciously. And I've seen it for sale at nurseries, which isn't illegal or regulated because it's not on the noxious weed list, but it
Mhm.
is absolutely an invasive plant that I would never want anyone to put in their yard. We actually don't have other questions queued up, I believe. One thing, so that's a prompt for any of you guys to chime in on chat with other questions. In the meantime, circling back to restoration work, right, as a restoration practitioner, that question about how long pesticides and herbicides can stay active in the environment, I would say that it's worth mentioning, I think, in streamside restoration, that herbicide use is one of those things in the toolkit that is used to manage some really tricky plants like Japanese knotweed as an example. And it's absolutely different in restoration because the crews that are applying those are licensed applicators and have to record everything down to the wind speed and tax lot that day. And those are, mixed with a surfactant that adhere to the leaves, and it's very targeted and breaks down very quickly. And so I think it's really what it tends to come down to is reading the label for any given chemical, because buying something at the store is going to be much different than how it's used in our projects.
Right. And there are data showing that pesticide use is often higher in urban areas than agricultural areas, for example, because it's so much more regulated, I think. So it's just something to keep in mind. And pesticide drift, too, is something to keep in mind. Like, the pesticides in your yard aren't just what you might be using, but they're what your neighbors are using, what the county might be using. Like, it's moving around. And it is an issue, I think. I think it's also something that is maybe easier to get a handle on in urban areas, because a lot of the pesticide use is just people do it because they believe that that's what you do as a responsible homeowner, or to take care of your yard. And just thinking about changing the way we view our gardens and our yards, as opposed to kind of this pristine but maybe kind of sterile habitat, to something that's full of biodiversity, that's full of life, that's full of insects, and because that brings in the birds and cool things like that. And so just thinking about gardening in a way that promotes life and biodiversity, and that means tolerating some insect damage on our plants, but knowing that that means we'll get ladybugs and lacewings and cool insect predators and birds.
Yeah, insect damage is habitat. Like that's a proof of a
Yeah.
plant. Exactly, it's success.
Yeah.
Someone asked if seeds from treated plants are harmful to pollinators.
It seems to be much less so. So seeds are probably safer.
Okay, that's great to know. In the chat just now, Michelle popped in the evaluation link for today. Since we're slowing down a little bit on questions, I wanted to just point everybody to that evaluation link because that's really helpful for us. And in the meantime, Angela, another question has come through asking if you could talk about pre-emergence such as preen. They wrote that it's sometimes useful in the winter where there's a lot of bark dust.
Yeah, I think that pre-emergent herbicides, so I mean, herbicides are a tool, like you said, Alexis. When you're trying to create habitat, sometimes the best way to create persistent habitat that can support pollinators and other wildlife is to knock back invasive species. And so pre-emergence can be useful as long as you're not going to be seeding, trying to plant from seeds right away.
Yeah.
We do have some guidance coming out on herbicides. So some herbicides can affect pollinators directly, but obviously not as much as insecticides.
Right. Yeah, I like one of the comments that came through about changing perceptions for HOAs to call, instead of homeowner associations, they suggested calling them habitat owner associations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we just need more people to infiltrate those HOAs.
Yes.
Change it from the inside.
Yep, that's my plan at least. Someone that I know just asked or just mentioned that they're interested in the Habitat Kit program, and we're curious if there's anything to highlight or focus on in the submitted proposal for those. It would be
Generally,
Oregon Habitat Kit.
more information is better. So it will ask about the site conditions, your site prep plans, how you're going to maintain the habitat, and then any pesticide risks. So those are like the broad categories. So we're
Mhm.
looking for people to demonstrate that you have a plan and the plants will probably survive. I mean, there's more to it, but that's basically what we're trying to evaluate, that you've thought about it, that you know what the weeds are, that you have a plan to knock them back, and you have a plan to take care of the project long term. The link there will take you, if you're in Oregon, the link will take you to the information there, and there's contact info. Michelle Blackburn and Corin Pease are running that program. If you're in California, you can email me. Or if you're in any of the other regions, just look at our Habitat Kit page and reach out to the people running those programs. We love to help.
Awesome.
And yeah, as you're filling out the project proposal form, feel free to reach out with any questions.
Mhm. And I just want to emphasize, this is Michelle, just want to emphasize that we will be sending out a follow-up email which will contain all these links for you to access the information and all of the wonderful links that featured in our presentations today. So thank you for providing all of those. Both Dakota has provided some and Angela has provided some. So usually on the Monday, and also a recording link will go out. So don't worry if you didn't get a chance to write all those down. We'll make sure you have them.
And someone, Angela, just asked if the habitat kits are available for Eastern Oregon. And I think it's just Willamette Valley in Southwestern Oregon, if the website's correct. What I will
right
say
now, yeah.
Right now, so the hope is to maybe expand those in the long term.
Yeah, it's only in its second or third year providing kits in Oregon. So we're trying to expand over time, but it just is dependent on funding.
Yeah. Sandy and Warren is the name of the person that submitted that question. And I would say that there's a person out of, I believe it's University of Oregon, Anthony Methalopoulos, delivered one of the talks last year. And I'm not sure if it's still active, but there's some work on expanding pollinator habitat creation in Eastern Oregon that Anthony would maybe speak well to.
You could also
Yeah,
check out Monarch Joint Venture. They do have a milkweed giveaway program, I believe.
Neat. I love that. One final question that I think has come through is one question for you, Angela, specifically. Michelle, there's one for you in the chat also. But for Angela, I'm not sure if this is in your purview, but someone is tuning in, not from California or Oregon, but actually from Indiana. And they were saying that they really struggle with using the right soil in their pots. And we're curious if you had any suggestions. For me, I would be called to go to a local nursery and ask that.
Yeah, you could try that. We have a staff person in Indiana who might be able to answer that. Yeah, I would reach out to like your local master gardeners. I'm sorry, I'm in California, so I probably can't answer that question. I could come up with an answer, but I think you get a better one from your local master gardeners.
Yeah, cool. Oh, and the person that asked about Eastern Oregon is already tapped in, familiar with Anthony and on the board of the pollinator pathway in Bend.
Oh, good.
So that's really cool. Okay.
The Fish and Wildlife Partners Program also does work to help landowners, like private landowners, improve habitat and for wildlife, including pollinators. So assuming that program continues to be funded, that is another great opportunity to help you cost share to improve habitat.
Awesome. Well, great. There's a couple little tidbits in chat, but otherwise I'm gonna try to bring my video back on so that Dakota and I can wave farewell to you. And thank you, Angela, so much. Everybody, I'm gonna pop that evaluation link in chat once more. And Michelle, can you tell everybody what we'll be talking about next week?
Yes, absolutely. So thanks again to our speakers for today. And next week, which will be week 4, we will be hosting all about soil, the magic ingredient. So we will be having a speaker from Oregon State University Extension Service, Logan Bennett, if any of you know him. I know a lot of you are involved with master gardeners and such. And so he's going to be talking about soil. Let me just see, and we will have Gail Shalom, who's from Water Environment Services, who are our sponsor for this program, will be providing an introduction. And just to emphasize what Angela was saying about how your involvement in what you're doing in your garden, helping to put those puzzle pieces together and form connectivity that really does make a huge difference to our pollinators, our birds, providing a network to help these creatures to survive. Many of you have asked about previous recordings of other speakers. If you go to our Clackamas Community College Environmental Learning Center's website, I did put it in the chat. I can probably share that again. Here we go. We do have recordings from previous years available, and we will be putting those recordings up there on our website in the next few weeks as we go through. But thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much, Angela and Dakota and Alexis, for your help in making this happen. Hopefully we'll not have too much snow and we can start getting back in our gardens before too long. I do hope so. All right, thanks everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.